Imagine you're stepping into a ballroom in New York in the 1880s. The light of 1,000 gas lamps glimmers off crystal chandeliers. Silk gowns sweep across polished floors. Jewels sparkle at every turn. Diamonds, pearls, emeralds arranged not just as decoration, but as declaration. But what you're really noticing, as you stand on the edge of the room, is not the gowns or the jewels. It's the women who wear them. Because this is not just a party. It's an audition, a coronation, and a battlefield all at once. The Gilded Age is often remembered for its fortunes. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Rockefellers, men who built railroads, banks, and industries that reshaped America. But tonight, our story belongs to the women, the ones who ruled society, not from boardrooms or stock exchanges, but from ballrooms, opera boxes, and sprawling Newport cottages that looked suspiciously like palaces. They were the queens of the Gilded Age, women who decided who was admitted to the highest circle, who set the rules of fashion and etiquette, and who maneuvered their children, often reluctantly, into marriages that linked American money with European title. They built dynasty as carefully as any industrialist built a railroad, and they did it under pressure so relentless it could break even the most gilded of lives. Tonight, we'll meet Caroline Astor, the gatekeeper of the 400, who decided who mattered in New York. We'll follow Alva Vanderbilt, who staged one legendary ball and forced old money to bow to the new. We'll trace the journeys of the dollar princesses sent across the Atlantic with dowries large enough to save crumbling castle, and we'll glimpse the private lives behind the glamour. The loneliness, the strict confinement, the hidden costs of being dazzling. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you're in the right place. So let this story carry you. And if you're still awake at the end, I'll be here to say goodnight. That's the story I'm telling tonight. Imagine New York in the late 1870s. The Civil War is over, the railroads are booming, and money seems to pour out of the ground as easily as oil. Mansions rise along Fifth Avenue like mushrooms after rain, each one trying to outshine the last. Carriages rattle down cobblestone streets, their wheels splashing through puddles of melting snow as liveried footmen perch stiffly on the back. The skyline, still low and human-scaled, is already beginning to groan under the weight of ambition. This was the Gilded Age, a phrase coined by Mark Twain, who meant it with more than a little sarcasm. Gilded things, after all, are only covered in gold. Underneath, they may be anything but. Yet for the families who built their fortunes in railroads, steel, and banking, life felt less like sarcasm and more like a coronation. They had money on a scale America had never seen before, and they were determined to show it. But here's the twist. Wealth alone wasn't enough. A fortune could buy you a mansion, but it couldn't buy you into society. That doorway was guarded by women. The ballrooms of New York were less about dancing and more about strategy, and the women who hosted, attended, and adjudicated were playing the most delicate game imaginable. Men might have built industries, but women built reputations. The city itself reflected this duality. By day, men crowded Wall Street offices, trading stocks and shouting into telephone. By night, women transformed parlors into miniature kingdoms, with seating charts arranged like chessboards, and every invitation weighted like a contract. The goal was simple: recognition. Recognition that your family mattered. Recognition that your money was not just new, but legitimate, stamped with the approval of those who had been wealthy before you. Think of it this way. In our world today, wealth can sometimes seem like enough. A billionaire launches a social media app, and suddenly, everyone pays attention. But in the Gilded Age, wealth had to be laundered through the filter of society. And that filter was run by a very select group of women. Women whose smiles could open doors, and whose snubs could close them permanently. This was also an age of contrast. On the streets below, immigrants poured into tenements, living in cramped, airless rooms and sewing for pennies a day. Uptown, chandeliers glowed over banquet tables, groaning with food. For the poor, survival meant breadlines and factory shifts. For the rich, survival meant avoiding the humiliation of being excluded from Caroline Astor's ballroom. Different stakes, same desperation. And in this glittering, unequal, absurdly theatrical world, women were not background figures. They were the stars, the directors, and quite often the scriptwriters. Society did not move without them, and as we'll see, they ruled with rules, every bit as sharp as the steel their husbands built fortunes on. It's tempting to think of Gilded Age women as decorative, the ones in portraits with diamond tiaras and feathered fans. But in reality, they were less ornaments and more gatekeepers. They built the invisible scaffolding that held society together, and they guarded it ferociously. In this world, social standing mattered more than raw wealth. You could have millions from railroads or steel, but if Caroline Astor didn't acknowledge you, you were still considered vulgar. And so, women became arbiters of entry. Their parlors were customs houses, their ballrooms, border checkpoints. If you were invited in, your fortune was legitimized. If you were left out, all the money in the world couldn't buy respect. The tools of this power were subtle, but devastating. An invitation withheld, a seating arrangement altered, a whispered remark about someone's manners, or worse, their pedigree. Reputation moved like a fragile glass goblet. Once cracked, it could never be repaired, and women were the ones balancing those goblets with steady or trembling hand. But this wasn't just about cruelty, it was about survival. Old money families like the Astors or Schermerhorn knew that their position could be undermined by the flood of new fortunes rising in the city. Railroad, oil, finance, every month seemed to mint a new millionaire. Without rules, the old hierarchy would collapse under the weight of sheer cash. And so, they created rules, endless, intricate, exhausting rules about etiquette, fashion, even the dimensions of a ballroom. These rules became armor, a way of controlling who could enter their world. Caroline Astor, soon to be our main character, once declared that there were only 400 people in New York who truly mattered. Why 400? Because that was the capacity of her ballroom. Imagine declaring that society itself had a maximum occupancy. The audacity is almost admirable. Today, we might joke that the VIP list at a nightclub is brutally exclusive. In the Gilded Age, the nightclub was society itself, and the bouncer was a 60-year-old woman in diamonds. And what did this mean for the women themselves? It meant that their lives were performances. They were managers, strategists, event planners, and, in their own way, diplomats. Every ball, every dinner, every afternoon tea was a maneuver. Their gowns were statements, their guest lists battle plans, their children's marriages treaty. Theirs was not power measured in votes or bank accounts, but in influence. And in the Gilded Age, influence could be just as decisive as dollars. It is striking, though, how invisible this power could appear. Historians often write about the tycoons, the robber barons, the captains of industry. But the queens of society were shaping fortunes just as powerfully. They simply did it in silk gowns instead of business suits. They were conducting an orchestra that half the audience didn't even realize was playing. And so, when we talk about the Gilded Age, we cannot just speak of Vanderbilt mansions and Rockefeller accounts. We must also speak of the women who decided which of those mansions mattered and which of those fortunes could buy more than marble. These were the social queens, and their reign was every bit as dazzling and demanding as the monarchies of Europe. If there was one woman who could be called the undisputed queen of New York society, it was Caroline Astor, known simply as Mrs. Astor, because really, who needs a first name when your reputation is that unshakable? She ruled the social world with a gloved hand. Her authority was not official, of course. There was no law that said you needed Caroline Astor's approval, but in the New York of the Gilded Age, her approval was the only thing that mattered. She was the matriarch of an old, distinguished family, the Astors, whose fortune had been built not on railroads or oil, but on real estate. This mattered greatly because money from land was considered older, more respectable, less tainted by the noise of industry. The Astor fortune was practically woven into the fabric of New York itself. Houses, hotels, blocks of land stretching uptown. It was steady, it was established, and Caroline Astor used it as a throne from which to declare who was worthy. Her home, a mansion on Fifth Avenue, was less a residence and more a court. The drawing room was her throne room, the ballroom, her royal hall. It was there that she invented the concept of the 400. When asked why, she explained that 400 was simply the maximum number of people who could fit into her ballroom, and therefore, by definition, there could only be 400 people in society. Everyone else was everyone else. Imagine telling the other million people living in New York at the time that they simply didn't count. It takes a special kind of confidence to rewrite arithmetic in your own favor. Caroline Astor wasn't cruel in the cartoonish sense. She didn't slam doors in people's faces or shout insults down Fifth Avenue. Her power was subtler, a withheld invitation, a polite but chilly reception at a ball, a failure to return a call. These were the weapons of her rule, and they were far more devastating than any open insult could have been. Because in the Gilded Age, being invisible was the worst fate of all. Her annual ball was the pinnacle of social life. Invitations were coveted like holy relics, and receiving one was a declaration that you had arrived. The gowns were extravagant, the jewels blinding, the guest list carefully curated. To be seen, there was to be confirmed, not just as wealthy, but as accepted. To be absent, well, better not to speak of it. Better to pretend you had been traveling, indisposed, anything but simply overlooked. But Caroline Astor was not just an organizer of parties. She was a symbol of continuity. In a city exploding with new fortunes, she stood as a reminder that there were rules, traditions, pedigrees that mattered more than cash. She was the bulwark against chaos, the gatekeeper who could not be bought. For all the whispers of her rigidity, many secretly admired her because her rules made society legible. Without her, the whole system threatened to dissolve into vulgarity, and vulgarity was the ultimate sin. If all this sounds absurdly formal and exhausting, that's because it was. Imagine a world where every dinner party was a diplomatic summit, where every gown was a press release, where your very presence in a room was a headline. Caroline Astor lived this life and demanded that everyone else live it too. And yet, beneath the diamonds and etiquette, there was something almost relatable. The desire for order in a chaotic world, the fear of being displaced, the endless effort to control what can never truly be controlled. And that was Caroline Astor's reign. She defined the rules, she curated the list, she guarded the gates. For decades, she was the face of society itself. But rules, as we know, are always tested. And in the 1880s, one woman would rise to challenge her throne. If Caroline Astor represented the old order, then Alva Vanderbilt was the new. Born in the South to a wealthy family, Alva brought to New York not just fortune, she married into the Vanderbilt millions in 1875, but ambition, imagination, and a flair for drama that made her both admired and feared. The Vanderbilts themselves were the definition of new money. Their fortune, built by Cornelius Vanderbilt through shipping and railroads, was vast. But in the eyes of old society, it was also vulgar. Trains, after all, were loud, dirty things. You might ride one, but to admit your fortune came from them. Shocking. The Astors sniffed at the Vanderbilt, treating them as if their money, though larger, was somehow less legitimate. Alva was determined to change that, and unlike many of her peers, she understood something crucial. Wealth was not meant to be hidden, it was meant to be displayed. If society demanded spectacle, then she would give them spectacle on a scale they couldn't ignore. She was a strategist, a general in silk, willing to use every resource at her disposal to force open the doors of the elite. She began by building, quite literally. The Vanderbilt mansions that rose along Fifth Avenue were not just homes, they were fortresses of legitimacy. Alva hired the best architects, demanded the most lavish interiors, and filled them with treasures from Europe. Each gilded panel, each imported marble staircase, was a declaration, "We belong." The message was unsubtle, but it was effective. But Alva's true genius lay not just in stone and gold, but in people. She knew that in order to breach Caroline Astor's carefully guarded gates, she needed more than wealth. She needed a moment so dazzling, so undeniable, that even Mrs. Astor herself would be forced to recognize. And so, Alva turned to the most powerful weapon in her arsenal, the ball. The Vanderbilt Costume Ball of 1883 would become one of the most legendary events in American social history. The invitations were extravagant, the costumes jaw-dropping, the guest list carefully orchestrated. It was not simply a party, it was a declaration of war. Alva understood that New York was watching, and she was determined to stage a spectacle that would render the question of new money versus old irrelevant. And here's where the story turns deliciously dramatic. Caroline Astor, in all her grandeur, had initially refused to acknowledge the Vanderbilts. But when her own daughter received no invitation to Alva's ball, an event that promised to eclipse every other in the city, Mrs. Astor had no choice. She sent a calling card to the Vanderbilts, the symbolic gesture of recognition. Alva, in turn, sent the coveted invitation. The balance of power shifted. Old money had bowed, however reluctantly, to new. Alva emerged not just as a hostess, but as a co-regent of society. She proved that wealth, when wielded boldly, could bend even the strictest rules. Her triumph at the Vanderbilt Ball marked a turning point in New York's social order, one that rippled through every parlor and mansion, and she wasn't done. Alva would go on to play roles in the women's suffrage movement, in philanthropy, and in shaping the cultural life of the era. But at this moment, in 1883, her greatest achievement was simple. She had outmaneuvered Caroline Astor. She had forced the old guard to share the throne. And she had done it with costume, champagne, and the sheer power of spectacle. It's hard not to smile at the audacity. Imagine today, someone throwing a party so spectacular that the entire social order had to rearrange itself around it. Alva Vanderbilt didn't just throw a ball, she declared a revolution, and she won. On the night of March 26, 1883, New York discovered just how far one woman's ambition and one family's fortune could go. Alva Vanderbilt, still smarting from Caroline Astor's refusal to acknowledge her, staged a party so extravagant that it made the newspapers gasp and the city gossip for months. The Vanderbilt Costume Ball was not just a social event, it was the declaration of a dynasty. Picture the mansion on Fifth Avenue, newly completed and already infamous. Its rooms glittered with imported chandeliers, marble staircases, and walls paneled with gold leaf. But on this night, the interiors were transformed into a living theatre. Alva instructed her guests to appear in costume, not merely themed outfits, but elaborate historical and fantastical garb. Tailors and designers worked for weeks. Silk, velvet, feathers and jewels were ordered from Paris and sewn into gowns that weighed as much as small children. The guest list numbered more than 1,000, though the city's attention was fixed on a single name, Mrs. Astor. Would she attend? For weeks, her refusal to acknowledge the Vanderbilts had left her daughter without an invitation. But finally, in an act of social chess that must have cost her considerable pride, Mrs. Astor called formally on the Vanderbilt, thereby extending recognition. The invitation was sent, and Mrs. Astor appeared. Her presence was the ultimate capitulation. The Vanderbilts were no longer outsiders. Inside, the costumes dazzled. One Vanderbilt daughter appeared as an electric light, her gown studded with tiny bulbs powered by a hidden battery, a spectacle that must have startled the guests nearly as much as the invention itself. Others, dressed as medieval queens, Venetian noblewomen, Greek goddesses. Diamonds glittered in hair and on bodices, pearls looped in ropes around necks. The sheer density of gemstones on display could have ransomed a small European nation. The press, normally restrained in discussing private entertainments, could not help itself. Columns described the gowns in meticulous detail, noting the cost, the fabrics, the provenance of the jewels. Reporters compared the event to royal coronations in Europe, with the Vanderbilts positioned as America's self-appointed monarchy. And to be fair, that was exactly the point. For those lucky enough to attend, the ball was a blur of champagne, music, and endless spectacle. For those excluded, it was a humiliation that lingered for years. Imagine standing outside, reading about gowns worth more than your entire fortune, knowing that entry to this glittering world was forever barred to you. That was the cruelty of the Gilded Age. Its excesses were flaunted not just for pleasure, but for exclusion. But beyond the glitter, the Vanderbilt ball marked something larger. It was the moment new money officially broke into the old guard's citadel. Mrs. Astor's appearance was more than attendant, it was surrender. The Vanderbilts had used wealth as a battering ram, and Alva had orchestrated the victory with flawless theatricality. Today, we might compare it to a viral event that changes the social order overnight. A gala so widely photographed, so impossible to ignore, that suddenly the people who scoffed at you last week are calling you today. Alva's ball was the 19th century equivalent of breaking the internet, only instead of memes, it was diamonds and medieval costumes. And when the night ended, when the last guest stumbled into the cool air of Fifth Avenue, New York was no longer the same. The Vanderbilts had arrived, and society had bent to make space for them, all because one woman understood that in the Gilded Age, power was not whispered, it was shouted, sung, and sequined under the glow of electric lights. If the Vanderbilt ball represented the victory of new money in America, another phenomenon revealed the ultimate ambition of Gilded Age mothers, exporting their daughters to Europe. These were the so-called dollar princesses, wealthy American heiresses whose fortunes were traded for European title. It was the ultimate social exchange program, only with less studying abroad and far more diamonds. The logic was simple. Europe's aristocracy had title, palaces, and centuries of tradition. What they increasingly lacked was money. American families had the opposite problem, staggering amounts of cash, but no nobility attached to their names. Put the two together, and you had what society considered the perfect marriage. European prestige funded by American dollars. The scale was astonishing. Between 1870 and the outbreak of World War I in 1914, over 100 American heiresses married into the British aristocracy alone. Hundreds of millions of dollars flowed across the Atlantic. Dowries rebuilt crumbling estates, restored castles, and saved noble families from bankruptcy. In return, American mothers could proudly announce that their daughters were duchesses, countesses, even princesses. The exchange was so common that it almost became routine. Ah yes, another Vanderbilt marrying a Churchill. How quaint. But beneath the glitter lay a colder truth. Many of these marriages were arranged with little regard for personal affection. A daughter might find herself bartered for a title she had never dreamed of, while her dowry was spent on repairing roofs and refurnishing hunting lodges. The social triumph was her mother's. The daily reality was her own. Take Consuelo Vanderbilt, one of the most famous dollar princesses. In 1895, at just 18 years old, she was forced into marriage with Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. Her dowry, the equivalent of $90 million today, restored the grand Blenheim Palace. The wedding was celebrated as a transatlantic triumph. But Consuelo's life inside the palace walls was lonely, controlled, and ultimately miserable. Years later, she divorced the Duke, a rare act of independence. and her memoirs revealed the heavy cost of being used as a social pawn. Not all stories were tragic. Jenny Jerome, an American beauty, married Lord Randolph Churchill in 1874 and became the mother of Winston Churchill. Jenny navigated British society with wit and flair, and while her marriage was turbulent, she carved out a role for herself as a political hostess. Another heiress, Mary Leiter, married George Curzon, who later became Viceroy of India. As Viceroy, she presided over a realm larger than most European, glittering in jewels that seemed almost designed to announce America's arrival on the world stage. Still, for every Jenny Jerome who thrived, there were others who endured quiet isolation. The castles were cold, the traditions suffocated, the husbands inattentive. Letters home often carried a tone of resignation. One heiress wrote bitterly that her dowry had fixed her husband's roof, but nothing could fix his manners. Yet from the perspective of the Gilded Age mothers, the marriages were triumphs. Each union validated their power, proving that American women could conquer even Europe's oldest family. The newspapers treated each engagement as international news. The public thrilled by the idea of American girls becoming duchesses. It was social theatre on a global stage, and every wedding was an act in the performance. Today, it's tempting to compare this to celebrities marrying into royalty, the Meghan Markles and Grace Kellys of, but the dollar princesses were less about love stories and more about transaction. They were the currency by which American families purchased legitimacy. And though many of the women paid dearly in unhappiness, their mothers stood triumphant, convinced that they had secured their family's place in history. So, when we picture the Gilded Age, let's not think only of glittering balls and Newport cottages. Let's also remember the young women boarding ships across the Atlantic, their trunks filled with gowns, their futures mortgaged against ancient castles. They were queens, yes, but queens bought at a price. The idea of the dollar princess might sound like a general trend, but it also lived in the bodies and minds of very real women, young heiresses whose lives were staged like political treaties. Some of their names have drifted into footnotes, while others have remained infamous. Together, their stories illustrate the strange mixture of triumph and tragedy that defined this transatlantic exchange. Take Consuelo Vanderbilt, perhaps the most famous of all. Her mother, Alva, the same Alva who once forced her way into Caroline Astor's society with a ball, decided that no ordinary marriage would do for her daughter. Consuelo, beautiful and demure, was matched with Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. The wedding in 1895 was hailed as the union of American dollars and British nobility. But what the newspapers didn't print in such detail was Consuelo's unhappiness. She had wept as the vows were spoken, her life redirected not by choice, but by strategy. Her dowry of $2.5 million, equivalent to about $90 million today, was poured into restoring Blenheim Palace, a Baroque marvel that had become too expensive for its aristocratic owners to maintain. Consuelo had rescued the building, yes, but in the process had surrendered her own freedom. Her marriage was cold and controlling, her husband indifferent. Eventually, she divorced him, scandalous in its own right, and later remarried for love. In her memoirs, written decades later, she spoke with both sorrow and clarity about the pressure of being forced into a role she had never wanted. The irony is that her mother Alva, once so determined to secure her daughter's place in history, eventually joined her in the women's suffrage movement, as though at last realizing how deeply society had confined the very daughters it claimed to elevate. Another story belongs to Jenny Jerome, who married Lord Randolph Churchill in 1874. Unlike Consuelo, Jenny approached her role with fiery wit and dazzling charm that made her a sensation in British society. The marriage itself was hardly smooth. Lord Randolph was moody, unreliable, and at times cruel, but Jenny carved her own space, becoming a celebrated hostess and eventually the mother of Winston Churchill. Through her, the American heiress became part of Britain's political DNA. Yet even Jenny's independence was contained within limits. Her reputation was often scrutinized, her freedom to act interpreted as scandalous, and her very beauty weaponized as gossip. She lived brilliantly, but never without cost. Then there was Mary Leiter, who married George Curzon, future Viceroy of India. Their marriage was hailed as one of the grand triumphs of the era. Mary, the daughter of a wealthy Chicago businessman, became Viceroy of India, presiding over an empire larger than most European countries. Her jewels dazzled, her gowns shimmered. Her presence was described in breathless detail by the press. Yet beneath the glamour lay an immense burden. She was expected not only to embody American wealth, but also to maintain British imperial dignity in a land already groaning under colonial rule. She died young, worn down by illness and the pressures of her role. These women were not alone. Over 100 American heiresses crossed the Atlantic between 1870 and 1914, their fortunes funding dukes, earls, and viscounts. Some marriages brought real partnership, others were joyless, but in every case, the women themselves carried the weight of transatlantic ambition. They were asked to exchange comfort for cold stone castles, freedom for title, affection for prestige. Their lives became the proof that American women could conquer even the oldest strongholds of Europe, but also the proof that conquest often came with sacrifice. It's tempting to see them only as tragic, but perhaps it's more honest to see them as complicated. Women who endured, adapted, sometimes rebelled, and often left indelible marks in ways their mothers could not have predicted. Their jewels may have glittered, but it was their resilience that shone longest. While the dollar princesses sailed across the Atlantic, the queens who remained in New York waged their battles closer to home. For them, life was less about palaces abroad and more about a ceaseless choreography of social calendars, wardrobes, and households so large they resembled small corporations. The social season itself was a masterpiece of organization. Winters were spent in New York, with an endless carousel of balls, dinners, opera performances, and private salons. Spring meant travel to Europe, shopping in Paris, touring salons, arranging marriages. Summers brought Newport, Rhode Island, where the so-called cottages, sprawling mansions designed to resemble French palaces, served as stages for weeks of elaborate entertaining. And then, in autumn, preparations began all over again. It was exhausting, relentless, and inescapable. Behind the scenes, armies of servants executed the vision. Butlers, footmen, cooks, maids, governesses, coachmen, sometimes numbering in the dozens, kept the machine running. A ball was not simply a party. It was a logistical feat requiring coordination of food, music, lighting, flowers, and endless champagne. Women were the managers of these spectacles. Though society rarely acknowledged their labor, to maintain a household of that scale required organizational skills worthy of any CEO. But because the tasks involved gowns and banquets, they were dismissed as woman's work. Fashion, meanwhile, was both an obsession and a weapon. Gowns were ordered from Parisian designers like Charles Frederick Worth, each custom-fitted and often costing more than an ordinary person's annual salary. A woman might change dresses 3 or 4 times in a single day: a walking dress in the morning, a visiting gown in the afternoon, an opera gown in the evening, and a ball gown at night. Each outfit communicated status, taste, and, crucially, the ability to afford endless novelty. Jewelry was equally important. Diamonds, emeralds, and pearls were displayed with almost military precision, layered not just for beauty, but for intimidation. A rival hostess might be reminded, in one glance, of the gulf between their fortunes. One shining example of this obsession was Alva Vanderbilt's marble house in Newport, built between 1888 and 1892, designed by Richard Morris Hunt. It cost the equivalent of nearly $400 million in today's dollars. Inspired by Marie Antoinette's Petit Trianon, the house was a temple of Beaux-Arts opulence. a grand salon dripping with gold leaf, a dining room with marble walls, and a bedroom ceiling imported intact from a French chateau. The house was not just a residence, it was a manifesto. It declared, in architecture and marble, that the Vanderbilts were permanent fixtures of high society. And this was the truth of daily life for these queens. Every act was calculated. A dinner party was not casual, it was strategic. A gown was not chosen for beauty, but for its statement. A summer afternoon at a Newport cottage was less relaxation and more theatre. Their lives were rehearsed performances, every gesture laden with meaning. Modern comparisons almost feel quaint in contrast. We might stress over Instagram outfits or wedding seating charts, but the women of the Gilded Age lived their entire lives in that heightened state. Their calendars were not just busy, they were binding. To fall behind, to appear disorganized, to make a single misstep was to risk exclusion. And yet, for all the absurdity, there is something impressive about it. These women managed households, wardrobes, and reputations with a precision that rivaled any tycoon's balance sheets. They did it without recognition, under constant scrutiny, often at the cost of their own peace. And they did it while smiling, gliding, and glittering, as though the whole exhausting performance were effortless. For all the balls and banquets, the queens of the Gilded Age understood something important. Dazzling gowns and glittering jewels could only carry one so far. If their reign was to be legitimate, it needed a nobler purpose. And so, philanthropy and cultural patronage became essential parts of their role. Not just acts of generosity, but carefully curated performances of morality and refinement. To be clear, philanthropy was not new. Wealthy families had always donated to churches, orphanages, or causes that aligned with their values. But in the Gilded Age, philanthropy became something larger. It was a public stage where women could exercise influence, display leadership, and justify the staggering wealth that separated them from the rest of the nation. In a world where social inequality was glaring, where the poor crowded into tenements while the rich built marble palaces, philanthropy was not just expected, it was required. Hospitals, schools, and benevolent societies sprang up across the country, often with the names of wealthy families etched proudly on their facades. Women organized charity balls that raised both funds and prestige. To host such an event was not only an act of generosity, it was a declaration of one's centrality in the social order. Guests arrived in their finest gowns, donated to worthy causes, and simultaneously reaffirmed the hostess's position as both benevolent and indispensable. But philanthropy also allowed women to stretch the boundaries of what society permitted them to do. Men dominated politics and business, but women could dominate hospitals, libraries, and schools, so long as they did it under the umbrella of charity. Mary Elizabeth Garrett, for example, used her fortune to insist that Johns Hopkins University open its medical school to women. It was a radical demand, disguised in the polite language of a donation. Her money spoke, and in doing so, it carved out opportunities for generations of women who would otherwise have been excluded. Others turned to the arts. Opera houses, libraries, and museums blossomed under the patronage of Gilded Age women. Isabella Stewart Gardner, the Boston socialite, took this to extraordinary heights. She not only collected art from around the world, but also built a Venetian-style palace in Boston to house it. Every arch, every window, every courtyard was arranged to create an immersive experience. She decreed that the museum should remain exactly as she left it, ensuring that her vision would outlive her. Today, visitors still wonder her creation, stepping directly into the mind of a woman who refused to let her wealth fade into obscurity. Salons became another outlet. In drawing rooms draped with velvet, women hosted gatherings of writers, artists, and politicians. Ideas were exchanged over tea and champagne, opinions shaped in ways that no formal meeting could replicate. These salons became informal centers of culture and politics, their influence subtle but profound. A clever hostess could steer conversations, introduce thinkers, and shape reputations, all while appearing to preside over nothing more than a pleasant evening. Yet, like everything else in the Gilded Age, philanthropy was double-edged. Yes, hospitals were funded, schools built, art collected, but these acts also served to polish reputations and cement legacies. A woman might insist on a plaque bearing her name above a hospital door, ensuring that her benevolence would be remembered long after the champagne at her last ball had gone flat. It was generosity, certainly, but also strategy, the creation of monuments that doubled as social insurance. Still, it would be unfair to dismiss these efforts as shallow. Many women poured genuine passion into their causes. Some found freedom in philanthropy, a chance to exercise skills of leadership, organization, and vision that society denied them elsewhere. For some, charity work was the one arena where they could speak openly, command respect, and shape the future without needing anyone's permission. And perhaps that is the lasting legacy of Gilded Age philanthropy. It blurred the line between performance and authenticity, between duty and desire. It allowed women to step into roles of public importance, even as they were confined by private expectations. The hospitals, museums, and schools they built still stand. The art they collected still inspires. The reforms they championed still ripple through history. So when we imagine these queens in their gowns and jewels, let's also imagine them in quieter moments, reviewing plans for a hospital, writing letters to university trustees, hosting artists in their parlors. Their influence was not only glitter and spectacle, it was bricks, books, and brushstrokes, enduring reminders that even in an age of excess, women found ways to leave legacies of substance. For all the glittering gowns and marble palaces, the truth of Gilded Age queens is this: their lives were performances staged under relentless pressure. Every ball, every dinner, every promenade down Fifth Avenue was another act in a play that never ended. And like all performers, they lived with exhaustion, doubt, and the quiet fear that one misstep might ruin everything. The demand for perfection was constant. A hostess was expected to manage a household that functioned like a small country, orchestrating servants, menus, and guest lists with flawless precision. At the same time, she was expected to embody refinement, grace, and beauty, as if the stress of running a mansion were invisible, erased beneath diamonds and silk. Newspapers reported on gowns, not fatigue. Gossip focused on jewels, not migraine. The women themselves were erased beneath the roles they were forced to play. Marriage, too, carried its weight. A Gilded Age wife was not primarily a partner in love. She was a manager of dynasties. Her role was to produce heirs, safeguard the family's reputation, and, in many cases, endure her husband's indiscretions silently. Romantic affection was pleasant if it appeared, but it was rarely the foundation of these unions. Social standing came first, feelings were secondary, and when feelings did intrude, loneliness, frustration, boredom, they were locked away behind polite smiles and carefully orchestrated calendars. The confinement was real. Etiquette manuals of the time made clear that a woman's life was to be lived in the parlor, the ballroom, and the opera box. Private space was rare, privacy itself nearly impossible. Every move was observed, discussed, and judged. To slip, to falter, to show too much emotion was to invite whispers, whispers that could ripple through society and undo years of careful effort. Even their health reflected the strain. Doctors wrote endlessly about female complaints and nervous disorders, terms that cloaked exhaustion, anxiety, and depression in medical vagueness. Women were given tonics, rest cures, or simply told that suffering was the price of refinement. And yet, within this golden cage, women carved out small refuges. Some found solace in gardening, turning plots of land into personal sanctuaries. Others in horseback riding, where for an hour they could feel something like freedom. Some collected art, books, or curiosities, pouring themselves into passions that gave meaning beyond the ballroom. And many formed close friendships with other women, bonds of support and intimacy that softened the sharp edges of their roles. These friendships, often overlooked by historians, were lifelines, places where honesty could flicker through the haze of performance. What's most striking, perhaps, is how invisible these struggles were to the outside world. The Gilded Age queens were dazzling, untouchable, enviable. To themselves, many were weary, confined, and sometimes quietly broken. They lived lives that glittered, but they glittered under pressure, like diamonds forced into shape by relentless heat. And this is the duality of their legacy. They were arbiters of taste, rulers of society, creators of dynasties. They were also women who bore impossible expectations, who endured loneliness and scrutiny, who found ways to survive in roles they had little choice but to play. Their reign was dazzling. It was also demanding. And in the end, the weight of the crown was heavier than the sparkle of the jewel. And that is the story I wanted to tell you tonight. The Gilded Age was gilded not just because of money, but because of the women who turned money into meaning. Caroline Astor, drawing her invisible line of 400 names. Alva Vanderbilt, forcing her way into the room with a ball so spectacular that even Mrs. Astor had to bow. The dollar princesses, sent across the Atlantic to trade fortunes for title. The queens who filled marble palaces, hosted opera, and signed donations that still shape hospitals and museums today. They ruled without thrones, legislated without laws, commanded without armies. Their power was informal, but immense. And their lives, though outwardly dazzling, carried strains and sacrifices that few outside their world ever saw. They were the arbiters of an age, but also its prisoners, outwardly gilded, inwardly pressured. So when you imagine the Gilded Age, don't picture only the robber barons and railroads. Picture the women in silk gowns, deciding who entered the ballroom. Picture the daughters sailing to Europe, jewels in their trunks, anxiety in their hearts. Picture the queens who reigned over a world of chandeliers and marble, and who bore the weight of it quietly behind the sparkle. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, this is your moment to let go. The chandeliers have dimmed, the music has faded, the jewels have been locked away in velvet cases, the queens have stepped off the stage, and so can you. So close your eyes, let the story drift into silence, and sleep well. Good night. Written by Clara Finch.